There is a list, not a myth, not a legend, softened and reshaped by 10,000 retellings around 10,000 fires. A list, rows, columns, entries, the kind of thing a bookkeeper writes, not the kind of thing a poet writes. And that is the first strange thing about it, before we have even told you what it says. Because everything else that survives from ancient Mesopotamia in this vein, the hymns to Nana, the descent of Inanna, the flood account of Utnapishtim, reads like literature. It has rhythm, it has repetition built for the ear, for recitation, for an audience sitting in torchlight. This does not. This reads like a grain ledger, like a tax roll, like something a scribe filled out because it was his job, not because he was moved to. 14 entries, 13 of them end the same way. A small pressed mark, a seal, closing the row, done, filed, finished. The 14th does not have that mark. Every other entry on this tablet has a closing seal. This one doesn't. And once you notice that, once somebody points it out to you, and you go back and look again, you cannot stop noticing it. Because a ledger with one open row isn't a story. It's an account that's still being kept. We are going to spend the next 3 hours inside that ledger. We're going to tell you what a small, scattered group of researchers believes the other 13 entries describe. We're going to tell you what they believe the 14th entry says about the world you are sitting in right now, watching this. And we are going to be honest with you, all the way through, about where the history stops and the story begins. Because that line matters, and most of what gets made about this subject deliberately blurs it. We're not going to do that to you tonight. But we are going to leave you, at the very end, with the same feeling the tablet leaves behind when you actually hold a photograph of it and look at that unclosed row. Something here was never finished, and nobody has gone back to close it. A quick word on what you're about to watch. Sumerian civilization, its writing system, its astronomy, its mathematics, all of that is real, and where we tell you it's real, we mean it. The tablet at the center of this story, the conquest ledger, the 14 entries, the 3-state seal system, is not a document that has been excavated. It's a frame we've built, in the tradition of a much older kind of storytelling, to walk through a body of genuine Sumerian myth and genuine modern astronomical anomalies from a single, unifying angle. Think of it less like a documentary claim and more like historical fiction wearing a documentary's clothes. We'll tell you, chapter by chapter, exactly which parts are which. Now, the ledger. Act 1. The ledger. Chapter 1. Why Sumer keeps coming back. Every few years, somebody rediscovers Sumer. Not literally. The ruins have been excavated for 170 years. The tablets have been sitting in museum drawers since Victoria was on the throne. What gets rediscovered is the feeling of it. The feeling you get the first time someone tells you that this civilization, this specific one, in this specific stretch of river valley between the Tigris and the Euphrates, appears in the archaeological record already holding a full toolkit. Writing. Base 60 mathematics, the same math that still divides your clock into 60 minutes and your circle into 360 degrees. Codified law. Organized medicine. A calendar precise enough to track the moon's drift against the solar year and correct for it. And it appears to arrive fast. Not instantly. Nothing in archaeology is instant. But fast enough, and completely enough, that generations of writers have looked at that curve and asked the obvious, dangerous, irresistible question, where did all of this come from? Here is where we have to slow down and be careful, because this is exactly the point where most videos in this genre start cutting corners, and we'd rather lose you for 30 seconds than lie to you for 3 hours. The honest academic answer is not nobody knows. The honest academic answer is we have a partial answer, and it's genuinely interesting, and it doesn't require aliens. Long before Sumerian cuneiform writing proper, the archaeological record of the Uruk period shows small clay tokens, cones, spheres, discs, used for centuries as accounting devices, tallying grain, animals, oil. Over time, those tokens got pressed into wet clay to leave impressions. Then the impressions got simplified into drawn signs. Then the drawn signs got abstracted into the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. It's not seamless in our record. There are real gaps, but it is not a case of writing appearing from absolutely nothing. It's worth dwelling a moment longer on just how genuinely advanced the verified material actually is, because the honest version of this story doesn't need any invention to be remarkable. Sumerian mathematics used a sexagesimal, base 60, number system, and traces of that system are still embedded in daily life today, in ways most people never think about. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That's not folklore. That's a real, documented, continuous mathematical inheritance running from real Sumerian and Babylonian clay tablets straight through to the clock on your wall right now. Base 60 has genuine practical advantages over our familiar base 10 system. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, which makes fractions and ratios considerably easier to handle without a written decimal system. A real mathematical convenience that likely helped drive its adoption and its remarkable staying power. Real, surviving Sumerian and Babylonian mathematical tablets include multiplication tables, tables of reciprocals, tables for computing squares and cubes, and even, in a famous tablet catalogued as Plimpton 322, now held at Columbia University, what many mathematicians and historians of science interpret as an early list of numbers related to what we now call Pythagorean triples, sets of whole numbers satisfying the relationship underlying the Pythagorean theorem, compiled roughly 1,000 years before Pythagoras himself is traditionally said to have lived. Interpretations of exactly what Plimpton 322 was used for remain genuinely debated among specialists. Some scholars favor a practical, surveying-related purpose, others a more purely mathematical, almost recreational interest in number patterns. But the tablet's real existence and the real sophistication of the number theory it displays isn't in dispute. None of this requires an ancient-astronaut explanation to be worth marveling at. If anything, we think it's a stronger, more durable kind of wonder. The wonder of what unaided human attention, sustained patiently across centuries by a literate, organized, motivated civilization, can actually produce without any outside help at all. So why tell this story at all, if the mainstream explanation isn't actually empty? Because the Sumerians themselves didn't tell it that way. That's the detail that keeps pulling people back, generation after generation, and it's a real detail, not an invented one. The Sumerians, in their own texts, did not describe a slow, human trial-and-error climb toward civilization. They described a delivery, beings called the Anunnaki, a word most plausibly meaning something like those of princely blood, high-ranking figures in the Sumerian divine hierarchy, arriving, already knowing, and giving humanity what it needed to become civilized. Not teaching through generations of slow discovery, handing it over. That is a genuinely strange thing for a civilization to say about itself. Most origin myths describe humans as made, or born, or shaped from clay by divine hands. Sumer has that too, in the Enki and Ninmah traditions. But Sumer also has this second, stranger thread. A civilization that remembers being upgraded, given tools it didn't build, given knowledge it didn't earn the hard way. And among everything the Anunnaki are said to have given, one gift gets a disproportionate amount of attention in the oldest layers of the tradition. Not agriculture, not the wheel, not writing even, the moon. Specifically, the reading of the moon. Not simply, look up and notice it's full tonight, which every culture that has ever existed has done. Something more structured. A whole discipline, already complete, of tracking the moon's behavior against a framework that the earliest surviving Sumerian religious texts treat as already established, already known, already old, by the time anyone starts writing it down. That's the thread we're going to pull on for the next 3 hours. Not, did aliens build civilization? We're not going to pretend that question has an answer, because it doesn't. Not with what currently sits in museum drawers. The thread is narrower and, we think, more interesting. What did the earliest astronomers on Earth believe they were being given when they were handed the moon as an instrument to read? And is there a version of that inheritance encoded not as scattered omens, but as something closer to a record, a ledger, a list of outcomes? That's what the next 2 hours and 40 minutes are about. Chapter 2. The object itself. Let's be completely direct about what we're describing before we describe it, because the honesty matters more than the mystery here. There is no single, catalogued, universally agreed upon conquest tablet sitting in a case at the British Museum with a placard that reads 14 worlds. If there were, this would not be a video essay. It would be the biggest archaeological story of the century, and you would have heard about it from someone other than us. What we're building here, and we want to say this plainly, once, clearly, and then never again pretend otherwise, is a frame. An invented artifact, constructed the way historical fiction constructs a document, out of real materials, real formats, real conventions that Sumerian scribes actually used, assembled into something that could plausibly exist, in the same way a novel can put invented dialogue into a real king's mouth without claiming the king actually said it. So here is our invented ledger, built from genuinely Sumerian bones. Picture a tablet, not large, not the kind of monumental stela you'd carve a king's victories into, but a working document, palm-sized, the kind of thing a scribe in a temple archive would have produced for internal record-keeping, not public display, damaged along one edge, the way almost everything that survives 4,000 years of burial, flood, fire, and excavation is damaged. Catalogued, in our story, as part of a larger series recovered from a temple archive, the kind of unglamorous administrative context where the truly interesting things in real Mesopotamian archaeology often do turn up, buried among tax records and grain counts, because nobody in antiquity thought to hide the important things anywhere special. They just filed them. To make this invented object feel properly grounded, it's worth borrowing a little more real texture from how actual cuneiform tablets are described in real museum catalogues and real excavation reports. Because the genre this film sits inside usually skips this step entirely, jumping straight from ancient tablet to shocking translation, without ever pausing on the unglamorous, physical reality of what these objects actually are. A real, typical cuneiform tablet is small. Many administrative and literary tablets comfortably fit in the palm of a hand, some smaller than a modern smartphone, others closer to the size of a paperback book for longer literary or scholarly compositions. They're made of local river clay, shaped while wet, inscribed with a reed stylus, cut to produce the characteristic wedge-shaped cuneiform, literally means wedge-shaped, from the Latin cuneus, impressions, and then either sun-dried or, for documents meant to last, deliberately fired in a kiln. A real, meaningful distinction, since fired tablets survive dramatically better across millennia than sun-dried ones, which can dissolve if they're ever exposed to significant moisture again. Real archives sometimes preserve both, working, sun-dried documents meant for short-term use, and deliberately fired copies of texts a scribe or institution wanted to last. Our invented tablet, in this frame, is described as fired, deliberately, carefully preserved by whoever originally made it, which is itself a real, meaningful piece of information if you know how to read it. Someone, in our story, believed this particular document was worth the extra effort of ensuring it would survive. The structure, row by row, a name glyph, a symbol standing in for a place, a world, though the tablet itself never uses language that maps cleanly onto our modern idea of a planet. A duration marker, a numerical notation, a state symbol, one of exactly 3 recurring marks, and a short line of commentary, terse, unadorned, almost bureaucratic in tone. And that flatness is, in our framing, the single most important observational detail about the whole document, because everything else that survives from this tradition that describes divine action, the hymns, the epics, is performed. It has praise language, it has repetition built for a listening audience, it has emotional architecture, awe, fear, reverence, grief. This has none of that. No adjectives praising the Anunnaki's glory, no lament for what was lost, just name, duration, state, note, row after row. And that texture is not invented out of nothing. It's borrowed directly from something real. Actual Sumerian administrative documents, grain ledgers, temple inventories, the king lists themselves, really do read this way: terse, numeric, emotionally neutral, even when what they're recording is enormous. A king list will tell you a ruler reigned for what modern readers recognize as an impossible number of years, with exactly the same flat tone it uses to record a 5-year reign. The form doesn't editorialize. It just files. So the frame we're borrowing is this. What if one of these flat, administrative, unglamorous documents wasn't recording grain or kings, but outcomes, a record of what happened, place by place, each time the Anunnaki's ordering was imposed somewhere? 3 symbols recur throughout. We'll be using these terms for the rest of the film, so it's worth sitting with them now. Held, the ordering took, the world stabilized under it, the way a structure settles once its foundation has cured. Released, the ordering was deliberately withdrawn. Not lost, released. A choice, not a failure. Unfinished, still active, still open, no resolution recorded, because none has happened yet. 13 of the 14 rows on our ledger carry the first 2 marks, in some order, some pattern we'll walk through, across Act 2. Exactly 1 row carries the 3rd. We'll tell you now, so there's no false suspense about which row. You already know from the title. It's the last one, and in our frame, it's the one describing Earth. That's the object. Invented, built from real materials, real conventions, real texture, borrowed honestly from a civilization that really did keep its records this way. Now let's talk about what conquest, or ordering, or installation, whatever word you want to use for it, actually meant to the people who might have written something like this, if they had. Chapter 3. What ordering meant to a ledger keeper. If you grew up on the phrase ancient-astronaut theory, you probably picture something specific when you hear the word conquest attached to it. Ships, weapons, a war fought somewhere out among the stars, its wreckage scattered across a dozen mythologies, waiting for the right investigator to reassemble it. We're not going to give you that, partly because it's been done, exhaustively, by other people, and partly because we don't think it's the most interesting reading of what actually survives in the Sumerian material. There's a better word sitting right there in the real texts, and it isn't conquest, it's me. This part is genuinely Sumerian, not invented. So let's slow down and get it right. Me, pronounced roughly May, is one of the most important and most difficult to translate concepts in the whole Sumerian religious vocabulary. It shows up prominently in a real text called Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess Inanna gets the god Enki drunk and talks him into handing over the me, sometimes translated as divine decrees, sometimes norms, sometimes essences or ordinances. They're not laws in the modern sense, and they're not simple magic objects either. They're something closer to the underlying operating principles of civilization itself: kingship, priesthood, truth, falsehood, the crafts, the rites of lamentation, the making of weapons, the settling of disputes, even things as specific as the art of the hero or the kissing of the phallus. The me list in the actual text is long, strange, and covers an enormous range of what makes organized human life possible, both its noble parts and its unglamorous ones. Once Inanna has them loaded onto her boat of heaven, they can't easily be taken back. They've been installed, transferred from one place, one authority, into general circulation. That's a real concept. That's not us reaching. And it gives us something much more interesting to build with than a space battle. So here's the reframe our invented ledger runs on. What if conquest, in whatever word the scribe who kept this record might have actually used, wasn't primarily about armies at all? What if each entry on the list represents not a war, but an installation? The same kind of transfer Inanna performs on Enki, but performed on an entire world. The me of a place, imposed. A system of order, laid down. Under that reading, the 3-state system stops sounding administrative and starts sounding almost medical. Held means the installation took. The world's own systems adapted to and stabilized under the new ordering, the way a graph takes to a host. Released means something closer to what we might, in a more generous register, call graduation. The ordering was withdrawn on purpose, because the world no longer needed external maintenance. It had generated enough of its own internal coherence to run without the original installation propping it up. And unfinished means exactly what it sounds like. Neither outcome has been reached. The graft hasn't failed, and it hasn't been declared unnecessary. it's still being watched. We want to end this chapter on the reveal you already saw coming from the title, but let's sit inside it for a second before we move on, because this is the hinge the whole documentary turns on. In our invented ledger, 13 rows carry a closing seal, one does not, and the name glyph on that 14th, unsealed row, according to the small, scattered, mostly self-published body of researchers this frame is built to represent, corresponds to Earth, not conquered, not released. Still open, that's Act 1. From here, we're going to walk the other 13 entries, what a held world looks like, what a released one looks like, and what it might mean that 4 of them are damaged badly enough that nobody, in this story, can even tell which mark they originally carried. Then, in Act 2's back half, we're going to spend real time on the genuine Sumerian astronomy this frame borrows from, because that part isn't invented, and it deserves to be treated with more care than the genre usually gives it. And finally, in Act 3, we come back to entry 14, to the one that isn't finished, to the one that, if this frame means anything at all, is still being written right now, in real time, by whoever is left to keep the ledger. Chapter 3.5. How anyone can read this at all. Before we go any further into the list itself, we owe you one more piece of honest scaffolding, because everything we're about to walk through, real or invented, depends entirely on a fact most people never think to ask about. How does anyone alive today read a language that stopped being spoken over 2,000 years ago, written in wedge-shaped marks, pressed into wet clay, by people who left no dictionary, no grammar book, no translation key of any kind? The answer is one of the great, genuinely thrilling stories in the whole history of scholarship, and it deserves its own chapter, separate from anything invented in this film, because none of it needs embellishing. By the early 19th century, European scholars had known for a while that cuneiform script existed. Travelers had been copying down the strange wedge marks from ruins across Persia and Mesopotamia for over a century. But knowing a script exists, and being able to read it, are entirely different problems. And cuneiform was, if anything, a harder problem than most, because it wasn't one writing system. It was a family of related systems used across different languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Old Persian, Elamite, and others, each borrowing and adapting the wedge-based approach for languages that had almost nothing in common with each other. The breakthrough came from a cliff face in western Iran, at a place called Behistun, a sheer rock wall towering more than 300 feet above an ancient road, chosen deliberately by the Persian king Darius the Great, around 500 BCE, precisely because it was visible, prominent, impossible to ignore, and essentially impossible to reach and deface. Darius had a lengthy inscription carved into that cliff face, recording his rise to power and his suppression of a series of rebellions, and, critically for everyone who came 2,000 years later, he had it carved in 3 languages simultaneously: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all rendered in their own variants of cuneiform script, stacked in parallel columns. This is real. This genuinely happened, and its rediscovery by the modern world is a real story with a real central figure, a British East India Company officer named Henry Rawlinson, who first encountered the inscription in the 1830s while stationed in Persia, and who, over the following decade, at real physical risk, using ropes and ladders to access a rock face several hundred feet up a sheer cliff, painstakingly copied down thousands of individual cuneiform signs by hand, section by section, returning repeatedly over years to complete and verify his transcription. The Old Persian portion turned out to be the key. Old Persian cuneiform used a relatively small number of signs, and scholars already had some linguistic foothold through its relationship to later, better understood Persian languages, along with Greek historical references to Persian royal names and titles that let early decipherers test guesses against known proper nouns. A king's name, recognizable from Greek histories, ought to sound roughly the same in the newly transcribed text, and if the signs assigned to those sounds worked consistently across the whole inscription, the decipherment was probably on the right track. Working from that foothold, Rawlinson and several other scholars working in parallel across Europe, this was very much a competitive, multinational scramble, not a single solitary genius moment, gradually cracked Old Persian cuneiform by the early 1840s. That was only the first door. Cracking Old Persian gave scholars, for the first time, a fully translated version of the same text, also written in Babylonian cuneiform, the same trilingual inscription functioning as a genuine Rosetta Stone, letting researchers work backward from known meaning to unknown signs. Babylonian cuneiform was a far larger, far more complex system than Old Persian. Hundreds of signs, many of them representing whole syllables rather than single sounds. Several signs, sometimes representing the same sound, and the same sign sometimes representing several different sounds depending on context. It took another decade and a half of sustained, genuinely difficult scholarly work, much of it happening simultaneously among several independent researchers across Europe, before Babylonian cuneiform could be considered reliably readable. There's a moment in this real story worth sitting with, because it captures something true about how fragile scholarly certainty actually is, even when it eventually proves correct. In 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society in London ran an informal experiment to test whether the decipherment could really be trusted. 4 scholars, working independently and without consulting one another, were each given a copy of a newly discovered cuneiform inscription and asked to translate it in sealed submissions. When the 4 translations were opened and compared, they matched closely enough. Not perfectly, but closely enough in substance and structure to convince skeptical observers that the decipherment was genuinely sound, rather than 4 scholars independently guessing their way to different plausible-sounding nonsense. That test is real, and it's arguably the single moment the field of Assyriology can point to as its actual birth certificate. And once Babylonian cuneiform was reliably readable, the door to Sumerian, an older, unrelated language entirely, written using an adapted version of the same script, a little like how Japanese later borrowed and adapted Chinese characters for an unrelated spoken language, opened more slowly behind it. Over the following decades, through the painstaking work of scholars comparing bilingual Sumerian-Akkadian texts that the ancient scribes themselves had preserved, essentially handing modern researchers their own built-in translation dictionaries, thousands of years in advance, without knowing anyone would ever need them. We're spending real time on this, in the middle of an otherwise speculative film, because we think it matters for the same reason Chapter 4's methodology discussion is about to matter. Everything genuinely astonishing about Sumerian civilization that we've described so far, and everything genuinely astonishing still to come, the star catalogues, the eclipse records, the omen series, the me, is only accessible to us at all because of this real, hard-won, historically recent act of decipherment. For over 2,000 years, this entire body of knowledge sat unread, in the ground and then in museum drawers, in a language nobody alive could understand. The gap between "this civilization clearly knew remarkable things" and "we can actually verify what they knew" was closed by 19th century scholars climbing cliff faces and comparing sealed envelopes, not by anything supernatural. We think that's worth remembering every time this genre reaches for the word hidden or suppressed or forgotten. Sumerian knowledge wasn't hidden by anyone. It was buried by time, the way everything from every era eventually is, and it was recovered by ordinary, extraordinary human effort. The same kind of effort this film is asking you to bring to everything that follows. Patient, careful, willing to sit with genuine uncertainty rather than reaching for the most dramatic available answer. Chapter 3.75 The God Who Watched. Before we return to our invented ledger, it's worth spending real time with the actual deity the Sumerians associated with the moon, because he's a genuinely rich, genuinely well-documented figure in his own right, and most of this genre reduces him to a single sentence before rushing on to more speculative material. His name in Sumerian is Nana, sometimes rendered Nana Suen or simply Suen. In the later Akkadian tradition, he's called Sin, and it's under that name that he's often best known in broader popular reference today. He is, in the real, uncontested mainstream understanding of Mesopotamian religion, one of the oldest and most consistently important deities across the entire multi-thousand-year span of Mesopotamian civilization, worshipped continuously, under one name or another, from the earliest Sumerian city-states, through the Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian periods, a run of religious continuity longer than the entire history of most modern nations combined. His principal cult center was the city of Ur, a real, extensively excavated site, famous in modern archaeology partly because of Leonard Woolley's early 20th century excavations there, which uncovered the so-called Royal Cemetery of Ur, with its genuinely startling evidence of retainer sacrifice accompanying royal burials. At Ur, Nana's temple complex included a real, physically surviving ziggurat, a stepped temple platform, still standing today in partially reconstructed form, one of the best-preserved examples of Mesopotamian monumental religious architecture anywhere in the archaeological record. This is not invented. You can look up photographs of the great ziggurat of Ur right now. In the genuine mythological tradition, Nana is described as the son of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon associated with Nippur and Ninlil. He's the father, in turn, of Utu, the sun god, associated with justice, and of Inanna herself, the goddess whose real, documented dealings with Enki over the Me gave us the installation concept our invented ledger borrows from. That's a genuinely important lineage to sit with for a moment. In the actual Sumerian religious imagination, the sun and the principle of justice, and the goddess most associated with love, war, and the Me themselves, are both understood as descending from the moon. Lunar priority, in other words, the moon coming conceptually first, with the sun and the more dramatic, better-known deities following from it, is a real and significant feature of the authentic mythological hierarchy, not something this genre needs to invent to make the moon feel important. Nana's real, attested titles and epithets are worth hearing directly because they capture something genuine about how central this god was to Sumerian religious and intellectual life. He's addressed, across real surviving hymns, as a keeper of time, a measurer of months, a figure whose regular waxing and waning literally structured the calendar every Mesopotamian city depended on for agricultural planning, tax cycles, and religious festival scheduling. The Sumerian lunar calendar, a real, functioning administrative system, not a religious abstraction, divided each month according to the moon's actual observed phases, with the first visible crescent after new moon marking the start of each new month. A system that required someone, somewhere, watching the western horizon at dusk with real, sustained attention, month after month, for the entire practical functioning of the civilization's economic and religious life to hold together. There's a real surviving genre of hymns addressed to Nana, among them a composition modern scholars sometimes title A Hymn to Nana, part of the broader corpus of Sumerian temple hymns first assembled in something close to their surviving form, under the Old Babylonian period, but drawing on much older material, that describe him in language emphasizing exactly this watchfulness. A god whose light reveals what darkness conceals, whose steady return night after night gives human beings a way to measure and trust the passage of time in a world that would otherwise feel formless and unmarked. We're choosing our words carefully here, rather than quoting directly, out of respect for the fact that we haven't independently verified specific line-by-line translations for citation in this format. But the general thrust of this real hymnic tradition, Nana as watcher, measurer, and quiet guarantor of order across time, is well documented in the mainstream Assyriological literature on Mesopotamian religion. Here's why we think this real material matters more to this film than another layer of invented tablet ever could. Our fictional ledger keeper, watching an unfinished account, checking back on it periodically without needing to act, patient across enormous stretches of time. That figure isn't something we invented out of nothing. It's a fictional echo of a real, well-documented, 4,000-year-old religious role that Mesopotamian civilization built an entire god, an entire ziggurat, an entire calendar, and an enormous body of real surviving hymns around. The Sumerians didn't need an invented ledger to feel like the moon was watching something. They already believed that, sincerely, continuously, for longer than almost any other religious idea in the whole of Mesopotamian history, survived largely unchanged. Our invented 14-entry tablet is, in the most honest way we can describe it, a piece of modern historical fiction, built to dramatize a real, authentic religious intuition that Nana's worshippers already held, without needing any tablet at all, that watching the sky carefully, faithfully, across a lifetime and across generations, was itself a meaningful act. Not because it guaranteed anything, but because it was how a civilization without our instruments chose to stay in relationship with something larger than any single human life. Act 2, the 13, Chapter 4, Reading the Symbols, a methodology segment. Before we walk the list, we need to stop and show our work. This is the chapter where the genre usually speeds up, where the music gets more dramatic exactly when the claims get least supported, because slowing down to explain methodology doesn't feel as thrilling as cutting to another ominous glyph. We're going to do the opposite. We're going to slow down here, on purpose, because this is the chapter that decides whether anything that follows is worth your attention. So, how would anyone, in our story, or in real cuneiform scholarship, go from a damaged clay tablet to a claim about duration, about cycles, about timing? Here is the real answer, stripped of invention. Sumerian and later Babylonian astronomy is one of the genuine intellectual triumphs of the ancient world, and it did not require anything beyond patient, systematic naked-eye observation, sustained across an enormous span of time by an institution, the temple, that had both the motive and the continuity to keep doing it for centuries without interruption. The clearest surviving evidence of this is a real document called Mul Apin, a 2-tablet astronomical compendium, its content reaching back centuries before the copies we actually possess, that catalogues stars and constellations, records their heliacal risings, the date each year a star first becomes visible again just before dawn after a period of being lost in the sun's glare, and lays out relationships between stellar events and the solar calendar precise enough that modern astronomers have been able to check its claims against retro-calculated sky positions and find them holding up, not perfectly by modern instrumental standards, but consistently, in ways that indicate real, sustained, careful observation rather than guesswork. Alongside Mul Apin sits a much larger, stranger body of material, the Enuma Anu Enlil, an omen series running to dozens of tablets, cataloguing thousands of individual celestial observations, lunar, solar, planetary, meteorological, each paired with a predicted terrestrial consequence, in the omen literature's characteristic format. If this is seen in the sky, then this will happen on Earth. Most of it reads, to modern eyes, like superstition, organized with bureaucratic thoroughness. But buried in that same tradition are genuinely precise observational records, most famously the Venus tablets attributed to the reign of King Amisaduqa, a systematic log of Venus's first and last visibility, dates across a run of years, precise enough that modern chronologists have actually used it to help anchor disputed dates in Mesopotamian history, cross-checking the recorded Venus positions against retro-calculated astronomical models. And underneath all of it sits the real nodal cycle, the genuine, physical, 18.6-year period over which the 2 points where the moon's orbit crosses the plane of the ecliptic slowly precess backward through the sky. This is not mystical. It's orbital mechanics, and the Babylonians tracked it well enough, over a long enough span, to notice that lunar eclipses fall into a repeating pattern, now called the Saros cycle, roughly 18 years, 11 days, and to use that pattern predictively. So here's the honest bridge we're building, and we want to be exact about where it holds and where it doesn't. It is real, verifiable, mainstream accepted history that Sumerian and Babylonian astronomers tracked long celestial cycles with genuine mathematical sophistication, sustained across centuries, embedded in a religious administrative tradition that saw no contradiction between temple worship and precise observational record-keeping. That part is not speculative. You can look up mul.apin. You can look up the Amisaduqa Venus tablets. You can look up the Saros cycle. These are real. What is not real, what we are building on top of that genuine foundation, is the idea that a specific duration glyph on our invented 14-row ledger encodes a specific number of these nodal or planetary cycles, translating a held or released outcome into a precise span of centuries. That mapping is our invention, a piece of historical fiction laid over real astronomical infrastructure, the same way a novelist might have a fictional character use a real, working sextant. We're telling you this now, explicitly, so that everything from here forward can be enjoyed for what it is. A thought experiment run through real materials, not a claim about a document that exists. With that said, let's walk the list. Chapter 5. Entries 1 through 4. The Old Ones. Entry 1. The name glyph is badly worn. Worn in a way that, in our story, the tablet's damage pattern suggests happened early, from handling, as though this row was consulted far more often than the others. Whatever this world was, someone kept coming back to check on it. The state mark is held. Clean, deep, deliberately pressed. A seal that was clearly meant to last. The commentary line, in this frame, is a single short phrase, something like, stood without further tending. Not glorious, not triumphant, just, it worked, and it kept working, and nobody needed to come back and adjust it. We want to fold in something genuinely Sumerian here, rather than invent in a vacuum. The real concept of Duranki, sometimes translated as the bond of heaven and earth, a term appearing in genuine Sumerian religious geography attached to Nippur, the city the real texts describe as the spiritual center where the connection between the divine order and the terrestrial world was anchored. If our invented ledger keeper needed a real Sumerian concept to describe what held felt like from the inside, a world where the bond between the managing order and the managed place was simply stable, unremarkable, structurally sound, Duranki is close to the right shape for it. Anchored, load-bearing, not needing constant intervention because the foundation was doing its job. Entry 2, in our frame, carries the same mark, held, but a longer commentary line, one that our invented researchers argue references something closer to correction within stability rather than the absence of any disturbance at all. A world that wobbled, in other words, and was caught and recentered before the wobble became structural. This gives us room to introduce, honestly, a real and important distinction in the genuine Sumerian material, the difference between an omen and a catastrophe. The Enuma Anu Enlil is full of entries predicting disruption, bad harvests, the fall of a king, plague, that are treated in the text not as inevitabilities, but as warnings requiring ritual response. Real Mesopotamian religious practice included an entire professional class, the Baru diviners and the Arshipu exorcist scholars, whose job was precisely to read a bad omen and perform the correct ritual to avert its stated consequence. The cosmos, in the real tradition, was not fixed. It was negotiable, provided you noticed the warning in time and knew the correct response. That's a genuinely important idea, and it's the emotional core we want Entry 2 to carry. Held doesn't have to mean nothing ever went wrong. It can mean something went wrong, was noticed, and was corrected by someone, at some point, who was paying attention. Entry 3. The first entry in our sequence, marked held with visible additional annotation beyond the standard format, a scribal note pressed into the margin rather than the row itself. Our frame treats this as significant. Whoever was keeping the ledger cared enough about this particular outcome to add something outside the normal accounting structure. We won't pretend to know, within the story, exactly what the annotation said. The damage in our invented tablet's description is total at exactly this point, which, again, is the kind of convenient narrative device we want to flag honestly rather than dress up as a real gap in a real document. It's a storytelling choice, leaving a mystery inside the mystery, the way good fiction often does. Entry 4 closes this first cluster, and it's the last of the 4 old ones to carry the clean-held seal before the tone of the list shifts. If there's a real, genuine thread worth pulling here, it's this. Mesopotamian religious thought did not conceive of divine order as something installed once and left alone. The me that Inanna carries away from Enki have to be actively maintained, performed, reenacted through ritual, generation after generation, or they lose their force. Order, in the actual Sumerian worldview, was not a machine you switch on and walk away from. It was closer to a living relationship that required continuous tending. Let's slow down on Entry 4 specifically, because in our invented sequence, it's the row our fictional researchers spend the most time on, and it's worth understanding why. The commentary line on this row, in our frame, is longer than any of the previous 3, long enough that it starts to resemble something closer to a case study than a filed outcome. It describes, in fragments, a world where the installed order nearly failed early, stabilized only after what the text calls a second setting of the hand, and then held without further incident for the remainder of the recorded span. If entries 1 through 3 read like straightforward successes, entry 4 reads like a near miss that was caught in time. The ledger equivalent of a structure that cracked during construction, was reinforced, and then stood for centuries without anyone outside the original crew ever knowing how close it came to failing. We want to fold in something real here, because this near-miss framing gives us a natural opening to talk honestly about the actual textured relationship between Sumerian civilization and disaster in its own self-understanding. The real Sumerian king list, an actual ancient document, not an invented one, existing in multiple genuine copies and versions, famously divides history into two blocks: the impossibly long reigns of kings who ruled before the flood, and the more historically plausible reigns of kings who ruled after it, with a stark textual break in between, where the list simply states that the flood swept over the land and kingship was lowered again from heaven. That structural break, before catastrophe, after, is a real feature of a real ancient document, and it shows that the Sumerians themselves organized their own deep history around exactly this kind of near failure and recovery logic, long before any invented tablet needed to borrow the shape from them. Our fictional researchers, in this frame, read entry 4's second setting of the hand as a distant echo of that same structural instinct, the idea that even a world eventually marked held might have passed through its own version of a flood along the way, its own moment where the outcome could plausibly have gone the other way, quietly folded into a single terse clause rather than given its own dramatic account. It's a small detail, and we don't want to oversell it, but it's the detail that gives this early cluster its first hint of real tension, a reminder that held was never guaranteed, even for the rows that eventually got the cleanest seal. That's the emotional register we're carrying into Chapter 6, where the tone of the list and the mood of the film genuinely shifts. Chapter 6. Entries 5 through 9. The Released. Here the state mark changes, in our frame, for the first time across 5 consecutive rows. Released. We said in Act 1 that we didn't want you to hear conquest and picture only war and loss, and this is the chapter where that reframe pays off. Because in this invented ledger, released does not read like failure. It reads, across all 5 of these entries, like something closer to a graduation ceremony, formally logged. This is a good place to bring in something real and genuinely underexplored in the mainstream ancient-astronaut genre, the actual departure theme, already present in authentic Sumerian and Akkadian myth. The Anunnaki, across the real textual tradition, are not depicted as permanent, unbroken residents of Earth, micromanaging every harvest forever. Later, Mesopotamian religious and administrative texts show the pantheon's direct involvement receding over historical time, even within the ancient world's own internal chronology. Divine kingship narratives shift from "the gods walked among us and appointed the king directly" toward more mediated, ritualized, priest-administered forms of divine sanction. Real Mesopotamian religion, over its multi-thousand-year run, genuinely does show this pattern. Intense, personal, hands-on divine involvement in the earliest layers, giving way over centuries to a more distant, institutional, temple-mediated relationship. Our invented ledger borrows that real historical drift and reframes it as a design feature rather than a fading memory. What if release wasn't the gods getting bored, or busy, or simply forgotten by later generations who didn't experience them directly? What if it was the intended outcome all along? A world installed with an order it didn't yet have the internal coherence to generate on its own, tended long enough for that coherence to take root, and then, deliberately, on schedule, let go. Entry 5 in this frame is where our invented researchers place the shortest gap between the held seal and the eventual release. A world that stabilized fast and needed comparatively little tending before the order became self-sustaining. Entries 6 and 7 show a longer held period before release, centuries, in whatever the duration glyphs are argued to represent, and the commentary lines are notably warmer in tone than anything in the Old Ones cluster. If we're building a coherent emotional arc for our invented ledger keeper across this whole document, this is the section where that keeper sounds, for the only time in the whole tablet, something close to proud. Entry 8 is the one row in this cluster our frame treats as ambiguous, a released mark, but paired with a commentary fragment that some of the invented researchers in our story read as bittersweet rather than purely celebratory, a release that came with loss attached. Not every graduation, even a successful one, happens painlessly. Let's pause inside this cluster a moment longer, because it's worth giving each of these 5 rows a little more room than a simple summary allows. Entry 5, the fastest transition from held to released in our invented sequence, carries a commentary fragment our fictional researchers translate roughly as "needed only the first turning," a phrase that, in our frame, is meant to evoke the image of something like a key catching on the very first attempt, a lock built well enough by its maker that it barely needed adjusting once installed. If Entry 4 was our near miss, Entry 5 is its opposite. The cleanest, easiest success on the whole tablet, the row a proud ledger keeper would point to first if asked which world gave the least trouble. Entries 6 and 7, longer held before release, deserve their own texture too. Our invented commentary for 6 describes what the fictional translation renders as generations of quiet growing. No crisis, no near miss, simply time passing while the installed order slowly became unnecessary, the way scaffolding stops being load-bearing long before anyone actually gets around to taking it down. Entry 7's fragment is shorter but strikingly warm in tone for a document this flat everywhere else, a phrase our fictional researchers translate as "it asked to be let go," as though the release, in this one case, wasn't purely the ledger keeper's decision at all, but something closer to a request. Granted, we want to fold in something genuinely real at this point in the film, because this idea, order requested back, rather than simply withdrawn, has an authentic parallel worth knowing about. In real Sumerian religious practice, humans were not passive recipients of divine order. They were understood to actively participate in maintaining it through ritual. And there's a real and famous surviving genre of Sumerian literature, the Balag and Urshema laments, in which cities and temples call out, sometimes directly addressing a departed or absent god, asking for restored favor, protection, or presence. The real emotional grammar of Mesopotamian religion included exactly this kind of two-way address. Humans didn't just receive, they petitioned, mourned, requested. Our invented Entry 7 borrows that authentic emotional shape and applies it, fictionally, to an entire world's relationship with its ordering system, rather than to a single city's relationship with a single absent god. Entry 8, the bittersweet one, is worth sitting with a little longer too. Our frame gives it the longest surviving commentary fragment in the entire released cluster, badly damaged toward the end, but legible enough at the start to read, in translation, something like, "released, though not all of what was given returned with it." Our fictional researchers disagree, within the story, about what that means, whether it describes some literal thing left behind on the released world, or something more abstract, a change that the ordering produced, which didn't simply reverse itself once the ordering was withdrawn, the way a scar remains long after a wound has fully healed. We're deliberately not resolving that ambiguity, because we think a documentary that resolves every single detail cleanly starts to feel less like an honest reconstruction and more like a script with all its edges sanded off. Entry 9 closes the released cluster and gives us a natural place for a real, honest, tonal pivot in the documentary itself. A chance to sit, briefly, outside the invented frame entirely and ask a straightforward question. Why does a story like this, order given, tended, eventually withdrawn because a place became capable of standing on its own, land as comforting, even when we know, going in, that the specific artifact carrying it isn't real? We think the honest answer is worth saying out loud, on camera, rather than leaving implicit, because it's a genuinely appealing shape for meaning to take. Difficulty with a purpose, struggle that ends in independence, rather than either permanent dependency or total collapse. That shape shows up across an enormous range of real human storytelling, coming-of-age narratives, religious traditions built around trials followed by release, even modern therapeutic language about earned autonomy. because it maps onto something people actually want to believe is true about difficulty in general. That's worth noticing on its own terms, independent of whether any particular ancient tablet says it. Chapter 7. Entries 10 through 13. The cost. The last cluster before entry 14 is the hardest one to narrate honestly, and we want to lean into that difficulty, rather than paper over it, because in our invented framing, these 4 rows are the most damaged section of the whole tablet. The state glyphs on entries 10 through 13 are partially destroyed or ambiguous, readable enough to confirm a row exists, not readable enough to say with confidence whether the outcome was held, released, or something else the surviving vocabulary doesn't capture. We could invent a clean answer here. Almost every video in this genre does exactly that, at exactly this kind of juncture. The damage becomes an opportunity to insert whatever reading serves the narrative best, dressed up as a bold interpretive breakthrough by an unnamed independent researcher. We're not going to do that to you. The honest move, inside our own invented frame, is to say plainly, we don't know how these 4 ended. That gap is doing real narrative work in this story, and it should be allowed to sit there unresolved rather than being smoothed over. But we don't know doesn't mean there's nothing to describe. What survives, in our frame, is enough to sketch the shape of the damage itself, even without a legible outcome, and the shape of the damage is its own kind of story. Entry 10's name glyph is intact, unusually well preserved in fact, compared to everything around it. But the state mark sits directly beneath a long crack running through the clay, the kind of structural fracture that, in real ceramic and tablet conservation, typically comes from heat rather than simple burial pressure. Our fictional researchers read this, cautiously, as evidence the tablet was caught in fire at some point in its long burial history. A real and common fate for cuneiform tablets, incidentally. Fire is one of the reasons so many tablets survive at all, since a clay tablet accidentally baked hard in a burning building or a destroyed archive is often better preserved than one that was simply left to the elements. The irony, in our story, is that the same fire that likely helped preserve entry 10 well enough for us to have any tablet left to discuss is also, plausibly, exactly what destroyed the one detail we'd most want to read from it. Entry 11 carries almost no legible commentary at all. A name glyph, a duration marker, and then nothing. The row simply trailing into unworked clay, as though the scribe stopped mid-sentence and never returned to finish it. Our invented frame treats this one differently from the fire-damaged rows around it, not destroyed after the fact, but possibly never completed in the first place. That's a meaningfully different kind of gap. Not, we lost the ending, but maybe there never was one to lose, because whoever was keeping this account had to put it down before they could finish. Entry 12 is the most heavily damaged row on the entire tablet, barely a third of it legible by any reading, in our story, and what does survive doesn't cluster in a way that resembles the other row's format at all. Some fragments of the commentary line survive without any of the name glyph or state mark around them, which our fictional researchers argue, honestly presented as their weakest and most speculative claim in the whole film, might indicate this row was altered or reinscribed at some later point, written over, in other words, by someone other than the original scribe. We're including that claim specifically because it's the kind of claim this genre usually presents with far more confidence than the underlying evidence, a few disconnected surviving marks, could ever actually support. We'd rather show you a weak claim honestly labeled as weak than a strong claim dressed up to look stronger than it is. Entry 13, the last before Earth's row, is the only one of this damaged cluster where a fragment of the state mark itself partially survives. Not enough to read cleanly, as held, released, or anything else, but enough that our fictional researchers can at least confirm a mark was there, pressed with the same depth and care as every legible seal elsewhere on the tablet. Whatever happened to this world, someone believed at the time that it was worth recording properly. The record just didn't survive to tell us what they recorded. 4 rows, 4 different kinds of loss, one likely burned, one possibly left incomplete, one possibly altered, one simply too faint to read past a single confirmed mark. We think that variety is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it resists the single, tidy narrative most documentaries in this genre would reach for here. The tablet was deliberately damaged to hide the truth, or some equivalent claim of suppression. Ordinary damage accumulated across 4,000 years of burial, fire, flood, and excavation, doesn't need a hidden hand behind it to explain why some rows survive better than others. It just needs time, which is the one force in this entire story that we don't have to invent. What we can do, honestly, is connect this section to something genuinely real and genuinely worth 15 minutes of your attention. The actual, well-documented pattern of flood and collapse narratives that recur across unrelated ancient cultures, closely enough in structure that comparative mythologists have studied the pattern for well over a century. The Sumerian flood account, preserved most completely in the Sumerian king list tradition and in the later, more famous Akkadian versions embedded in the Atrahasis epic and in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a great flood sent to reduce or reset an overburdened human population, survived by a single forewarned figure, Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian, who is instructed in advance to build a vessel and preserve seed, animals, and craft knowledge. This account genuinely predates the biblical flood narrative by well over 1,000 years, and the structural similarities between the Mesopotamian and biblical versions, the vessel's dimensions, the release of birds to test for retreating water, the eventual landing on a mountain, are close enough that mainstream biblical scholarship broadly accepts direct or indirect literary influence rather than coincidence. And the pattern doesn't stop there. A comparable flood survivor rebuilds narrative appears in the Hebrew Noah account, obviously. But structurally similar collapse and renewal myths also appear in ancient Greek tradition. Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a flood sent by Zeus, repopulating the earth by throwing stones over their shoulders, and in a wide range of other, more distantly related traditions across the ancient world, each with its own local texture but a recognizably similar underlying shape. A civilization reaches some kind of breaking point, is reduced, and is rebuilt by whoever carried the right knowledge through the disruption. This is genuinely interesting comparative mythology, and it's worth presenting as exactly that, a real, well-studied pattern in how ancient cultures independently encoded the memory, or the fear, or both, of civilizational collapse and renewal, without overclaiming it as literal evidence that our invented ledger's damaged rows describe the same specific events. We think the pattern is compelling on its own terms. It doesn't need an invented tablet to make it worth thinking about, so we'll leave entries 10 through 13, exactly where our story finds them. Damaged, ambiguous, unclosed in any way we can honestly reconstruct. 4 rows that might describe worlds that held, worlds that were released, or something in between that the surviving vocabulary simply doesn't have a word for, and we'll carry that uncertainty, deliberately, into the row that matters most. Entry 14, Chapter 7.1, The Mound That Was a City. There's an earlier real story that has to come before George Smith's, because without it, there would have been nothing in the British Museum's backlog for Smith to find at all. In the 1840s, a young Englishman named Austin Henry Layard, restless, without a settled career, traveling through the Ottoman-controlled Middle East partly to escape a legal apprenticeship he had no interest in, began excavating a series of large earthen mounds along the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. Local tradition and some scholarly speculation held that one of these mounds, called Kuyunjik, sat atop the ruins of ancient Nineveh, the storied capital of the Assyrian Empire, a city known from the Bible and from classical Greek sources but, at the time, with no confirmed physical remains anyone had actually excavated. Layard's early digging and the subsequent work of his associate and eventual successor Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian from Mosul whose own contributions to the excavation are real, substantial, and historically undercredited relative to Layard's, uncovered something extraordinary: the real, physical remains of Nineveh, including the ruins of a monumental palace complex built by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, and, within that palace, room after room containing tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets and fragments, systematically collected, in real historical fact, by Ashurbanipal's own scribes, dispatched by royal order to copy and gather texts from temple and private archives across the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal's library is not an invented detail in this film. It is real, and it's genuinely one of the most important single archaeological finds in the history of the ancient Near East, because it wasn't simply a haphazard accumulation of documents. It was, by every indication in the surviving material, a deliberate act of preservation, undertaken by a literate, historically minded king who understood, in his own real, documented words inscribed on some of the tablets themselves, that he was assembling knowledge specifically so it would survive. Among the tens of thousands of fragments recovered from Ashurbanipal's library were astronomical omen texts, medical texts, literary works including multiple copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, royal correspondence, religious hymns, and administrative records, an entire cross-section of Mesopotamian intellectual life, deliberately curated and physically gathered in one place, roughly 26 centuries before George Smith would sit down with a fraction of it and recognize, in a single fragment, a story about a flood. We want to be honest about something in the way this genre usually tells this part of the story too. It's tempting, and common, to frame Ashurbanipal's library building as some kind of mystical act of transmission across time. A king somehow anticipating a future need for this knowledge centuries or millennia later. The real, documented historical motive was almost certainly more grounded than that, though no less impressive for being grounded. Ashurbanipal, by his own real surviving inscriptions, describes himself as a literate king, unusually so for Mesopotamian royalty, proud of his own ability to read cuneiform and interested, for reasons of both genuine intellectual curiosity and royal legitimacy, in assembling the accumulated scholarly and religious knowledge of his empire in one place, under his own authority. That's a real, human, historically graspable motive. Pride, curiosity, the exercise of centralized royal power through the control of knowledge, not a mystical act of foresight, and we think that real motive is, if anything, more interesting than the mystical version, because it means the survival of this entire body of material down to the present day rests on an ordinary, believable human choice, made by a real king for real reasons, rather than on anything requiring us to imagine intention reaching across 3,000 years. The library itself did not survive the fall of Nineveh unscathed. The city was destroyed by a coalition of Babylonian and Median forces in 612 BCE, and the palace complex housing the library burned. But here is the real, quietly remarkable irony sitting at the center of this whole story, one worth pausing on. The same fire that destroyed Ashurbanipal's palace also baked the clay tablets within it hard. The same way accidental fire preserved Entry 10's fictional damage pattern earlier in this film. Except this time, it isn't fiction. Sun-dried clay, left exposed to millennia of moisture and shifting soil, tends to dissolve and crumble. Fired clay survives. The destruction of Nineveh, a genuine historical catastrophe by any measure, may be a direct, real reason so much of Ashurbanipal's library survived legibly enough, 25 centuries later, for Layard and Rassam to dig it up, and for George Smith to eventually find Utnapishtim's flood inside it. Chapter 7.25 The Day the Flood Came Back. Before we get to the real history of the modern ancient-astronaut genre, we want to tell you one more true story, because it's one of the single best moments in the entire history of archaeology, and it belongs, honestly, in any documentary that spends this much time on Mesopotamian flood narratives. In December 1872, a British museum assistant named George Smith, a man with almost no formal education, who had started his working life as a banknote engraver and taught himself cuneiform in his spare time by studying tablets in the museum's collection, was working through a large, disorganized backlog of fragments recovered years earlier from the ruins of Nineveh, part of the real library assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, one of the largest and most important collections of cuneiform texts ever recovered in a single find. Smith was piecing together fragments of what we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, and on one particular fragment, part of what scholars now designate Tablet 11, he found a flood narrative, a great deluge, a warned survivor, a vessel built to specific dimensions, birds released to test for retreating water, a landing on a mountain, bearing an unmistakable, striking resemblance to the biblical flood account in Genesis, but demonstrably older. The real, well-documented account of what happened next is one of the great anecdotes of 19th century scholarship. Smith is reported, by colleagues who were present, to have become so excited upon fully realizing what he'd found that he began taking off items of his clothing in the middle of the museum workroom. Whether this was literal undressing in a fit of genuine excitement, as several period accounts describe it, or a somewhat exaggerated later retelling of real, intense excitement, the core fact isn't in dispute. Smith had found, for the first time in modern history, hard textual proof that the biblical flood story had a real, older, non-Israelite precursor, sitting in cuneiform in the British Museum's own collection, and he knew immediately what that meant. The public reaction. When Smith formally announced the discovery in a lecture in December 1872, was enormous. Front-page news across Britain, intense public and scholarly excitement, and a real, quite remarkable follow-up. The Daily Telegraph newspaper actually funded an expedition sending Smith back to the original excavation site at Nineveh, specifically to search for the missing fragments needed to complete the flood narrative. And, in a stroke of good fortune, real archaeologists still consider fairly extraordinary, Smith did find additional relevant fragments during that expedition, allowing the flood account to be more fully reconstructed. We're spending real time on this story for two reasons. First, because it's simply a great, true story, and this film owes you at least a few chapters built entirely on real material, this satisfying, without any invented tablets standing between you and it. Second, because it's a genuine historical example of exactly the kind of moment this whole genre tries, endlessly, to manufacture artificially. A hidden ancient truth, suddenly revealed, upending what people thought they knew about their own religious and cultural origins. The real version of that moment did happen. Once, in a museum workroom in London in 1872, discovered by a self-taught engraver with no formal credentials, verified through the same painstaking cross-checking and independent scholarly scrutiny process we described back in Chapter 3.5. It didn't need an invented artifact to be one of the most genuinely startling discoveries in the whole history of archaeology. It just needed a real fragment, a patient reader, and roughly 2 decades of decipherment infrastructure, Rawlinson's Behistun work, and everything built on it, already in place to make the reading possible at all. The full Gilgamesh flood account, as it survives across the reconstructed Tablet 11, describes the god Ea secretly warning a man named Utnapishtim that the god Enlil intends to destroy humanity with a flood, instructing him to tear down his house and build a boat, load it with his family, his craftsmen, and the seed of all living things, and seal it before the flood arrives. The storm, when it comes, is described as terrifying even to the gods themselves, a real, striking detail in the actual text, where the gods are described cowering, frightened by the scale of the destruction they set in motion. Utnapishtim's boat eventually grounds on a mountain. He releases a dove, then a swallow, both of which return, and finally a raven, which does not return, indicating the water has receded enough to find dry land and food elsewhere. A sequence of details that maps with striking, well-documented closeness onto the later biblical account of Noah releasing birds from the ark, a similarity real biblical scholars broadly attribute to genuine literary influence, direct or indirect, from the older Mesopotamian tradition into the later Hebrew one, rather than coincidence or independent invention. None of this requires our invented ledger to be worth 3 hours of your attention. It's real, it's documented, it's one of the most consequential textual discoveries in the history of comparative religion, and it happened because one persistent, self-taught reader kept looking at broken fragments other people had already given up on, until one of them told him something nobody alive had known in over 2,000 years. Chapter 7.5, Where this genre actually came from. Before we cross into Act 3 and Entry 14, we want to pause and be honest about something most films in this genre never address directly. Where did the specific idea of the Anunnaki as literal extraterrestrial visitors actually come from, historically, as a modern phenomenon? Because it has a real, traceable, surprisingly recent origin, and knowing that origin honestly changes how you should weigh everything the genre has told you, including everything in this film. The single most influential figure in popularizing this specific idea is a writer named Zecharia Sitchin, whose first major book, The 12th Planet, was published in 1976 and became the foundation of an entire publishing career and, arguably, of this whole modern genre as it exists today. Sitchin's central claim was that Sumerian texts describe a planet beyond Neptune, which he called Nibiru, drawing the name from a real Akkadian astronomical term, on a roughly 3,600-year elliptical orbit that periodically brings it through the inner solar system, and that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial beings native to this planet who came to Earth, genetically engineered early humans as a labor force, and were the real basis behind the various Mesopotamian deities. Here's what's genuinely important to understand, stated as plainly and fairly as we can manage. Sitchin was not a trained Assyriologist. He held a degree in economic history, worked for years as a journalist and executive in Israel before emigrating to the United States. And while he did study Hebrew, other Semitic languages, and Middle Eastern archaeology and history, his specific translations and interpretations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts have been reviewed, and essentially uniformly rejected by professional Assyriologists and Sumerologists, scholars who have spent entire careers specifically trained in reading these languages. The core objection from mainstream scholarship isn't dismissiveness or gatekeeping. It's specific and checkable. The Akkadian term Sitchin translates as referring to a planet, Nibiru or Nibiru, is well attested in real astronomical texts, including the real Enuma Anu Enlil material we discussed earlier. But in its actual, broader textual context, it functions as an astronomical reference point, most plausibly associated with the planet Jupiter, or with a specific position Jupiter occupies at a particular point in the year, tied to the god Marduk in Babylonian religious astronomical thought, not as the name of an otherwise undocumented hidden planet on a multi-thousand-year orbit. Actual working Assyriologists who have reviewed Sitchin's translations broadly describe them as reflecting a misunderstanding of Sumerian and Akkadian grammar and vocabulary. Some critics have gone as far as characterizing specific translations as effectively invented rather than derived from the actual text, though we want to represent that criticism accurately rather than overstate it. This is a real, substantial, ongoing area of scholarly disagreement between mainstream Assyriology and Sitchin's supporters, not a settled matter beyond any dispute in either direction, even though the balance of expert opinion sits heavily against Sitchin's specific translations. There's also a real, independent astronomical problem with the Nibiru claim, separate from the translation dispute entirely. A large planetary body on a highly elliptical orbit that regularly brings it through the inner solar system would be expected, under standard, well-tested orbital mechanics, to produce detectable gravitational perturbations on the orbits of the outer planets, effects astronomers have specifically looked for and have not found. It would also be expected to have a detectable thermal signature, since even a planet receiving very little sunlight for most of its orbit still radiates some residual heat, observable to modern infrared sky surveys, which have mapped the sky in exactly this wavelength range without turning up any such object. Real astronomers, across multiple independent survey programs, have looked for a Nibiru-type body and have not found one, and this absence is treated within mainstream planetary science as strong, though not in the strictest logical sense absolutely final, evidence against its existence in the specific form Sitchin proposed. We're telling you all of this directly, in the middle of our own speculative film, for a specific reason, because a large fraction of this entire modern genre, including plenty of content that presents itself with far more confidence than we're presenting this film, ultimately traces back to Sitchin's specific, contested, largely rejected translations, whether or not any given creator acknowledges that lineage. When you watch other material in this space making confident claims about the Anunnaki as literal alien visitors, about Nibiru, about ancient nuclear war or genetic engineering described explicitly in cuneiform texts, it's worth asking, every time, is this claim actually traceable to a real, verifiable cuneiform translation accepted by working Assyriologists, or is it traceable, one or two steps removed, back to Sitchin's specific, professionally disputed body of work, repeated by later writers with even less scrutiny than the original claims received. We built this entire film, from the opening cold open onward, specifically to avoid that trap, which is exactly why our own central artifact is openly, repeatedly, unambiguously labeled as invented, rather than presented as a genuine discovery we're just now revealing to you. We'd rather you finish this film knowing precisely which parts you could go check yourself in a university library and which parts exist only inside this specific piece of storytelling, than have you walk away with the two hopelessly tangled together, which, we think, honestly, is the actual harm this genre causes at its worst, regardless of how entertaining or emotionally compelling any individual installment of it manages to be. Act 3, the last one, Chapter 8, Entry 14. This is the longest chapter in the film, and it should be, because everything before it has been building the vocabulary this chapter needs in order to be readable at all. Here is the row, in our invented frame, as completely as the fictional damage allows it to be reconstructed. A name glyph, our invented researchers argue, corresponds to Earth, not through any claimed scientific decipherment, which we want to be clear does not exist, but through narrative placement. It's the final row, it's the only row without a closing seal, and a documentary built around the premise Earth is the last, unfinished entry only works if that's where the story points, so we're not going to pretend there's some independent decoding process behind it. That's the frame. We built it to point here. The duration glyph on this row, unlike the others, doesn't read as a completed span at all. In our story, it's rendered differently, open-ended, the kind of notation a bookkeeper uses for an account that is still accruing, rather than one that's been closed and totaled. And the commentary line, the last legible thing on the whole tablet, is short, our invented translation still being weighed. Now, what would it mean, inside this frame, for an entry to still be open? What would a ledger keeper, still actively watching, actually be watching for? This is where we want to bring back, carefully and honestly labeled, the strongest real material this genre has to work with, the genuine physical anomalies in what we actually know about the moon. Because whatever you think about invented tablets and speculative frames, these facts are not invented, and they deserve to be presented with their real weight rather than either overhyped or dismissed. The moon is receding from Earth at a measured rate of roughly 3.8 centimeters per year. This is not speculative, it's directly measured using retroreflectors the Apollo astronauts placed on the lunar surface, bounced with lasers from observatories on Earth, and tracked continuously for decades. That's real, precise, ongoing science. The moon's average density, at roughly 3.3 grams per cubic centimeter, is notably lower than Earth's, roughly 5.5 grams per cubic centimeter, consistent in the mainstream giant impact model, with a moon formed largely from lower density mantle material rather than a full complement of the iron-rich core material that makes up a large fraction of Earth's total mass. This is the leading scientific explanation, and it's a genuinely strong one, but it's fair and honest to note that some of the finer details of the impact scenario, including aspects of the moon's exact compositional match to Earth's mantle, are still active areas of ongoing planetary science research rather than fully settled. The Apollo seismic experiments really did register unusual, prolonged reverberation when spent lunar module stages were deliberately crashed into the surface, a real, documented observation that generated real scientific interest in characterizing the moon's interior structure, an area of study that continues today with more recent missions and models refining, without yet fully resolving, exactly what the moon's deep interior looks like. None of this proves anything supernatural. We want to say that as plainly as we possibly can. Real planetary science has real open questions about the moon's exact formation history. The same way, essentially every major scientific model of ancient, large-scale processes has some open questions at its edges. That's normal science, not evidence of concealment. But it's also fair and honest to say that these are genuinely unresolved details, not settled beyond any doubt, and a documentary in this genre does its audience a disservice, either by claiming these anomalies constitute proof of an artificial moon, or by pretending they don't exist at all. Let's go a little deeper into a few of these, one at a time, because the genre usually rushes past exactly the details that make them interesting on their own honest terms. Take the giant impact hypothesis itself, which is the real, mainstream, currently leading scientific explanation for how the Moon formed, roughly 4.5 billion years ago. A Mars-sized body, sometimes called Theia in the scientific literature, is believed to have collided with the early Earth, and the resulting debris, ejected into orbit, gradually coalesced into the Moon. This model does real, useful explanatory work. It accounts for the Moon's relatively low density and its comparatively iron-poor composition, since a large share of the ejected material would plausibly have come from the outer mantle layers of both bodies rather than their dense metallic cores. It also accounts, in broad terms, for the significant amount of angular momentum in the Earth-Moon system, which a slower, more passive formation process would struggle to explain. But real, working scientists studying this model openly acknowledge specific, technical points where it strains against the evidence. One of the most discussed is the striking isotopic similarity between Earth rocks and Moon rocks, specifically in oxygen isotope ratios, which function almost like a chemical fingerprint tying a given rock sample to the specific region of the early solar system it formed in. If the Moon formed mostly from the impact of Theia, as the classic version of the model suggests, we'd generally expect its isotopic fingerprint to differ noticeably from Earth's, reflecting Theia's presumably different original formation location. Instead, real measurements from Apollo-era lunar samples show the Moon's oxygen isotope ratios matching Earth's extremely closely, close enough that several serious, real, peer-reviewed alternative and refined versions of the impact model have been proposed over the past couple of decades, specifically to try to account for this closer-than-expected match, including models involving a faster-spinning early Earth or a series of smaller impacts rather than one large one, or extensive post-impact mixing between the vaporized debris of both bodies before the Moon fully coalesced. This is real, current, actively discussed planetary science, not a settled embarrassment for mainstream astronomy, and not proof of anything exotic either. It's simply an honest example of a leading scientific model still being actively refined against real data, which is exactly what healthy science looks like from the inside, even though it doesn't always make for a tidy headline. The seismic story is worth a similarly careful second look. Between 1969 and 1977, Apollo missions placed a network of seismometers on the lunar surface, real instruments, left behind and monitored for years, recording what are called moonquakes. Several types were identified. Deep moonquakes, apparently tied to tidal stress from Earth's gravity acting on the Moon's interior. Shallow moonquakes, whose cause is still not fully understood. Thermal quakes, caused simply by the extreme temperature swings between lunar day and night, causing the surface to expand and contract. And, most famously for this genre, the artificial impacts. Several spent Saturn V third stages and lunar module ascent stages were deliberately crashed into the Moon, specifically to generate seismic signals scientists could study, since a known, precisely timed impact of known force gives seismologists something they can actually calibrate their readings against. The real recorded result from several of these artificial impacts was reverberation lasting significantly longer, in some cases close to an hour, than a comparable impact would produce on Earth, where seismic energy dissipates much faster due to Earth's wetter, more heterogeneous, more fractured interior structure. This is real documented data, and it genuinely did generate real scientific interest and real ongoing research into what it implies about the physical structure of the Moon's interior. Most mainstream explanations center on the Moon being extremely dry and structurally more rigid and homogeneous than Earth, allowing seismic energy to travel and scatter for far longer before dissipating, rather than indicating any kind of hollow or artificial internal structure. But it's fair, and we think important, to say plainly that lunar interior structure remains an active area of ongoing research, including through more recent missions using different instrumentation, rather than a fully closed question in every last detail, which is exactly why it keeps showing up, honestly or dishonestly depending on the source, in discussions like this one. So here's what we want to do with all of this, honestly inside our invented frame. Not claim any of it proves Earth is entry 14 on a real tablet. Use it as the texture of what a ledger keeper watching an unfinished world might plausibly be watching. Real, measurable, ongoing changes, and open questions in the Earth-Moon system, genuinely still being characterized by real scientists doing real, careful, incremental work, repurposed as narrative color for our fictional accountant, still checking in on an account that hasn't closed. The same honest treatment applies to the other material we want to fold in here, borrowed and clearly labeled from the wider body of speculative writing this genre draws on, claimed correlations between lunar nodal cycles and patterns of social or political instability. We want to be very direct about this one. These correlational claims exist in various corners of alternative and astrological literature. They are not accepted within mainstream historical or social scientific research. The sample sizes involved in most versions of this claim are small, and the methodology is generally not built to rule out coincidence. We're including the existence of the claim, honestly labeled as fringe and contested, because it's part of the real landscape of ideas this genre draws from, not because we're presenting it to you as established. And that, honestly, is the most responsible way we know how to build this chapter. Real, verified lunar science, clearly separated from contested fringe correlation claims, both woven into a frame we've told you from the start is invented. Entry 14 stays open in our story, not because we can prove Earth's ledger hasn't closed, but because that's the emotionally resonant shape the whole documentary has been built to deliver. Chapter 8.5: What the Tides Actually Do. There's one more piece of real, verifiable science worth giving proper room to before we leave Entry 14 behind, because it's genuinely central to why the moon has always felt, to essentially every culture that has ever looked up at it, like more than just a light in the sky, its measurable, physical influence on Earth's water. The basic mechanism is real, well understood, and doesn't require any speculation at all. The moon's gravity pulls on Earth, and because the side of Earth closest to the moon experiences slightly stronger gravitational pull than the side farthest from it, the effect stretches Earth's oceans into a rough double bulge shape, one bulge facing the moon, one facing away from it. That Earth's rotation carries us through roughly twice a day, producing the familiar rhythm of high and low tides most coastal communities live around without a second thought. The sun contributes too, with roughly half the tidal effect of the moon due to its much greater distance offsetting its much greater mass, which is why tides are especially strong, called spring tides, a real technical term unrelated to the season. When the sun and moon align during new and full moons, and especially weak, neap tides, when they're at right angles to each other during the moon's first and last quarter phases. This part of the story genuinely doesn't need embellishing to be remarkable. The real gravitational relationship between Earth and the moon is strong enough to visibly move the entire ocean twice a day, every day, has done so for billions of years, and was worked out with real mathematical precision, first by Isaac Newton in the 17th century. Using the same law of universal gravitation he developed to explain planetary orbits, later refined considerably by subsequent physicists and oceanographers into the detailed tidal prediction models that let modern shipping, fishing, and coastal engineering operate today with genuine, checkable accuracy, years in advance, for any coastline on Earth. It's also real, and worth knowing, that the moon's tidal influence extends beyond the visible ocean surface. The solid Earth itself flexes slightly under the same gravitational pull, a real, measured phenomenon called the solid Earth tide or bodily tide, typically moving the ground itself by a matter of tens of centimeters, detectable with precision instruments, though not something you'd ever feel underfoot. And confined groundwater systems, aquifers sealed between layers of impermeable rock, do show real, measurable, well-documented fluctuations tied to this same tidal rhythm, because the same periodic stress that flexes the solid crust also periodically compresses and releases the pore spaces water occupies underground, nudging water pressure up and down in a way sensitive well instruments can detect, and that real hydrogeologists have studied and published on for decades. This is genuine, mainstream, peer-reviewed hydrogeology, not a fringe claim, though it's also a considerably smaller, more localized, more thoroughly explained effect than this genre sometimes implies when it reaches for phrases like, "The moon moves the groundwater," which can make a real, modest, well-understood physical phenomenon sound more mysterious and more consequential than the actual measured data supports. We wanted to give this real material its own honest, unhurried chapter, separate from any invented framing, because we think it demonstrates something worth carrying into the rest of this film. The true, factual relationship between the moon and Earth's water is already strange and beautiful on its own terms. An object roughly 250,000 miles away, held in orbit by nothing but gravity, physically moves the entire ocean, twice a day, every day, and reaches down even into water sealed underground, behind solid rock. You don't need an invented ledger, or a hidden correction cycle, or a claim of cosmic management to find that genuinely worth pausing on. It's one of the actual, factual, checkable reasons the moon has always mattered to human beings, quietly, mechanically, and completely without any need for embellishment. Chapter 9. Why conquest might be the wrong word. We want to spend this chapter turning the lens back on the film itself, because we think a 3-hour piece benefits from a pressure release moment like this, and because it does honest work beyond just pacing. Here's the question worth sitting with. Why does a title like The Tablet, that lists every world the Anunnaki conquered, pull people in, when a more accurate title, something like a speculative narrative frame built from real Sumerian myth and real lunar anomalies, plainly wouldn't? We think the honest answer says more about the audience than about ancient Mesopotamia, and it's worth being direct about it rather than letting the question hang unexamined. Stories about hidden order, a pattern beneath the apparent chaos of history, a ledger somewhere keeping score even when nothing on the surface looks accounted for, are appealing precisely because the alternative is harder to sit with. The plain, unglamorous, historically mainstream account of why civilizations rise, struggle, and sometimes collapse is messy. A tangle of climate, economics, disease, individual decisions, and enormous amounts of ordinary contingency, with no ledger keeper anywhere in the process, making sure the books balance. That account is almost certainly closer to what actually happened. Across essentially every documented historical collapse and recovery we have real evidence for. It's also less satisfying to sit inside, because it offers no guarantee that anyone, anywhere, is keeping score. A frame like the one we've built for this film, an unfinished account, someone still watching, an outcome that hasn't been decided yet, offers something the plain account doesn't, the sense that the present moment matters to something larger than itself. That's a real, human, completely understandable thing to want. It shows up far beyond this specific genre, in religious eschatology, in political narratives about history bending towards some destination, in the simple, private hope most people carry that their own struggles aren't just noise. We don't think wanting that is foolish, and we're not going to end this chapter by telling you it is. We do think it's worth knowing, clearly, when you're looking at a frame built to satisfy that want, rather than a document that happens to have been found satisfying it. That's the whole difference between the two versions of this kind of film. The version that tells you the tablet is real, and the version, like this one, that tells you honestly it isn't, and lets the story earn its weight some other way. So, maybe conquest is the wrong word, not because our invented ledger keeper would have used a gentler one, but because the whole frame of conquest, of external power acting on a passive world, is the wrong shape for what actually makes a real civilization's history compelling. Real Sumerian civilization is not less remarkable for having built its astronomy, its mathematics, and its writing system the hard way, generation by generation, than it would be if the Anunnaki had simply handed the whole toolkit over complete. If anything, we'd argue it's more remarkable. The genuine, verifiable story, patient, naked-eye observation sustained across centuries by a religious administrative institution that had every reason to keep doing it, is not a consolation prize next to the invented one. It's the more impressive achievement. There's a broader pattern worth naming honestly here too, because it extends well past Sumer specifically. A recurring feature of ancient-astronaut and lost civilization content across essentially every culture it's been applied to. Egypt, the Maya, Easter Island, the Indus Valley, is a quiet, rarely stated assumption that the people who actually lived in these places couldn't plausibly have achieved what they achieved on their own, that the real explanation has to come from somewhere else, something more advanced, arriving from outside. That assumption deserves to be named directly, because when you say it out loud, rather than letting it operate quietly underneath a "just asking questions" framing, it becomes a lot less comfortable to sit with. It's worth noticing, honestly, that this pattern has disproportionately been applied across the history of this genre to non-European civilizations. Egyptian pyramids, Mesoamerican temples, the ruins of Great Zimbabwe were all, at various points in the 20th century, seriously proposed by popular writers to be beyond the capability of the actual people who built them. Explanations, mainstream archaeology has subsequently and repeatedly demonstrated to be both unsupported by the physical evidence and, uncomfortably, echoing much older colonial-era assumptions about which peoples were and weren't capable of sophisticated achievement. We don't think every person drawn to this genre is thinking in those terms consciously, and we don't want to overstate the point into an accusation nobody watching this deserves. Most people watching content like this are drawn in by genuine curiosity and a genuine appetite for wonder, not by anything uglier than that. But we do think it's worth the genre, collectively, being more honest about where some of its foundational assumptions actually come from, and being more careful about which civilizations get treated as mysteriously advanced beyond their own capability, and which don't. Sumer, as it happens, gets treated fairly generously by this genre compared to some other ancient cultures. But the underlying assumption, when you trace it all the way down, is the same one, and it's worth sitting with, rather than passing over quickly. Chapter 10. The Other 13. Revisited. With entry 14's shape established, it's worth circling back through the 13 closed rows one more time, because the unfinished frame changes how they read. The held worlds, entries 1 through 4, in our invented sequence, stop sounding like the lucky ones and start sounding, instead, like the ones that simply required less watching. Not better outcomes necessarily, just resolved ones, filed. The ledger keeper in our story doesn't check back on those rows anymore, not because they don't matter, but because there's nothing left to check. The released worlds, 5 through 9, read, on the second pass, less like graduation and more like a genuinely bittersweet handoff. Something that was tended long enough to no longer need tending is also, by definition, something the tender no longer has a reason to visit. Independence and abandonment can look identical from a distance, and we think that ambiguity is worth sitting in rather than resolving cleanly one way or the other. And the 4 damaged, unreadable rows, 10 through 13, stop being simply a gap in the record and start, on this pass, feeling like a warning of a different kind entirely. Proof that not every account gets a legible ending, even inside a story about a ledger that supposedly keeps perfect track. Damage happens. Records get lost regardless of how carefully something was meant to be preserved. Whatever finally happens with entry 14, there is no guarantee, even inside our own invented frame, that the outcome will be legible to whoever comes looking for it later. There's one more real text worth bringing in at this point, because it offers a genuinely different and genuinely instructive model of divine cosmic order than anything we've drawn on so far. The Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, a real, extensively studied text, distinct from the earlier Sumerian material, but drawing on and adapting much older Mesopotamian religious ideas, composed probably sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE and recited, in real historical practice, as part of the actual Babylonian New Year festival. The Enuma Elish describes cosmic order arising specifically out of conflict, the god Marduk battling the primordial sea goddess Tiamat, defeating her, and then, in one of the most visually striking passages in the whole of Mesopotamian literature, physically splitting her body in half to form the sky and the earth, before organizing the stars, the calendar, and the roles of the other gods out of the resulting order. This is real, documented Mesopotamian cosmology, genuinely different in tone and structure from the more measured, administrative, installation and maintenance model our invented ledger has been built around throughout this film. We think it's worth naming that difference honestly, because it's a useful check against the temptation to treat the Mesopotamian view of cosmic order as one single, tidy thing our invented ledger simply reflects. It wasn't one thing. Real Mesopotamian religious thought across the many centuries and city-states and shifting political centers that produced it, contained multiple, sometimes contradictory models of how order came to exist and how it was maintained. Some more violent and conflict-driven, like the Enuma Elish, some closer to the installation and tending model we've drawn from the Me tradition and from Nana's real watchfulness, some folded into flood and renewal cycles like the Gilgamesh and Atrahasis material. Our invented ledger deliberately draws from the gentler, more administrative end of that real spectrum, not because it's more true to the authentic Mesopotamian worldview than the Enuma Elish's violent cosmic battle, but because it's the version that let us build the specific story we wanted to tell. A documentary drawing on the Enuma Elish instead would have been a legitimately different and legitimately Mesopotamian film, probably a louder, more combative one, closer to the conquest framing we've spent this whole act gently arguing against. That's worth sitting with as we close out this chapter. Even the choice of which real strand of authentic ancient tradition to build an invented frame around is itself a creative decision, not a neutral discovery. We chose maintenance over battle. A different filmmaker, working just as honestly from just as real a textual foundation, could have chosen the opposite, and it would have been an equally legitimate use of the same civilization's genuine mythological inheritance. Here's the line we want to leave this chapter on, because it's the thesis of the whole film condensed down to a single thought. If Entry 14 eventually closes held, this was never really a war. It was maintenance, and maintenance that works looks, from the inside, indistinguishable from just living your life. And if it closes released, it was never a war either. It was the end of a tending relationship that had simply done its job. The only version of this story where conquest was ever really the right word is the version where nobody is still keeping the ledger. And in our story, at least, someone still is. We started this film with an image, a row on an invented tablet, without a closing seal, in a document that otherwise closes every row it opens. We want to end on the same image, because we think it earns its weight better now than it did 3 hours ago, with all the real history and real astronomy and honest labeling that sat between here and there. To say it plainly, one final time, there is no tablet. The 14 entries, the 3-state seal system, the invented researchers quoted along the way, all of it is a frame, built deliberately from real Sumerian materials, the genuine me concept, the real texture of Mesopotamian administrative record-keeping, the actual, verified lunar science, the real comparative flood mythology, assembled the way historical fiction assembles a document, not the way an archive produces one. What isn't invented is the shape the story leaves behind, an account that isn't finished yet, a present moment that might matter to something keeping score, even if, especially if, nobody can prove that anything is. We don't know how this row closes, neither does anyone else. Whatever any documentary in this genre, including in its more overclaiming versions, might tell you with more confidence than the evidence actually supports. What we do know, because it's simply and verifiably true, is that real people, 4,000 years ago, looked at the same moon you can walk outside and look at tonight, tracked it with a patience and a precision that still checks out against modern computation, and built an entire civilization's worth of meaning around the belief that watching carefully mattered. That much, at least, doesn't need an invented tablet to be true. Think back, for a moment, across everything real that actually got us here, across 3 hours, none of it needing a single invented word to be worth telling. A self-taught scholar, climbing a cliff face in Persia for the better part of a decade, copying signs he couldn't yet read. 4 independent translators, sealing their work in envelopes so that no one could accuse the reading of being a shared delusion. A young man with no formal training digging into a dusty mound because local rumor said a lost city might be underneath it, and finding one. An assistant in a London museum workroom, so overcome by what a broken fragment told him that the story of his reaction has outlived him by 1.5 centuries. A king, 26 centuries ago, who liked to read, and who used his own political power to gather up his empire's accumulated knowledge into one building, not knowing, and almost certainly not believing, that the fire which would eventually destroy that building would also be the reason so much of what he gathered is still legible today. None of those people needed an unfinished ledger to make their work matter. The work mattered because it was real, because it was hard, and because each of them, in their own time, chose to keep going past the point where giving up would have been easier and no less respectable. We don't know how Earth's row closes, if there ever really were a row to close. Neither does anyone else. Whatever any documentary in this genre, including in its more overclaiming versions, might tell you with more confidence than the evidence actually supports. What we do know, because it's simply and verifiably true, is that real people, 4,000 years ago, looked at the same moon you can walk outside and look at tonight, tracked it with a patience and a precision that still checks out against modern computation, and built an entire civilization's worth of meaning around the belief that watching carefully mattered. That much, at least, doesn't need an invented tablet to be true. The list only gets a closing mark once in our story. Nobody's written ours yet. If you made it all the way to the last row with us, thank you. Genuinely. 3 hours is a long time to sit with something we told you, over and over, wasn't real. That kind of patience is rare, and we don't take it for granted. This is Old Sealed Doc. Every video on this channel runs the same way you just watched. Real history, real texts, real archaeology. And when we build something on top of it, we tell you exactly where the seam is. No fake discoveries. No, they don't want you to know this. Just old documents, sealed for a long time, opened carefully, on camera, together. If that's the kind of channel you want more of, hit subscribe. We've got more ledgers to open. If this one got under your skin a little, the open row, the ledger keeper, all of it, tap like. It's the easiest way to tell us this kind of story is worth making more of. And if there's someone in your life who'd sit through 3 hours of Sumerian myth and lunar seismology for one good open ending, send them this. Word of mouth is the only algorithm this channel has ever really trusted. One more thing before you go. Down in the comments, we want to know, which row got you? The near miss in entry 4, the one that asked to be released, or the 14th, the one still open? Tell us. We read every one. Until the next tablet, stay curious. Stay honest about what's real. We'll see you in the archive.